Stop. Listen. Pay attention. Chosen one. This is not background noise, and it is not meant to be absorbed casually. It is meant to meet you exactly where you are standing right now. You have felt a strange compression lately. Not panic, not chaos, a pressure that tightens quietly. You wake up already tired. You move through the day functional, but carrying a weight you cannot explain to anyone without sounding vague or dramatic. So you stop trying. You keep it contained. That containment is important. This message arrives because that tension reached a threshold, not a breaking point, a recognition point. Something in your system registered that what you have been experiencing is not random, not weakness, and not a failure to cope. It is a signal asking to be interpreted, not endured. You may have noticed subtle isolation. Not because people vanished, but because conversations stopped touching the real layer of your experience. You stayed present, productive, outwardly stable, yet inwardly aware that something was being tested without announcement. Fatigue lingered even after rest. Focus narrowed. You questioned yourself quietly, not in despair, but in a steady attempt to make sense of the strain. There is urgency here, but not danger. The urgency is about timing, not threat. About clarity, not fear. You were not meant to carry this without context. You were meant to understand it at the right moment, and that moment is now. What you interrupted was not a scene, not an event you could point to. It was a process. A sequence that expected your participation through confusion, self-doubt, and passive compliance. Instead, you remained coherent. You did not collapse. You did not spiral. You continued to function while something unseen lost momentum around you. That matters more than you realize. This message is intentional. It is precise. It is not meant to excite you or alarm you. It is meant to orient you, to explain without revealing everything at once, to give language to what you already sensed but could not frame clearly. You are not here to be convinced. You are here to remember something you already know but temporarily set aside in order to keep moving. Stay with this. The explanation unfolds from here. This message is not for everyone, and you already know that without being told. It is not because others are excluded, but because others would not recognize themselves in it. You did. That recognition was immediate and quiet. No rush, no thrill, just a steady internal acknowledgement that something here aligns too closely to ignore. This is for you because what occurred did not require your belief to function. It required your presence. You did not imagine it into existence, and you did not overcome it through force. You simply remained yourself, while something expected you to fracture, hesitate, or lose internal alignment. That distinction matters. You are being addressed as the chosen one, not as a title to adopt, but as a description of position. You were positioned inside a situation that tested integrity, clarity, and internal structure. Not consciously. You were not warned. You were not briefed. Yet your system responded with an unusual steadiness that did not need effort to sustain. Think carefully. You did not feel strong in the dramatic sense. You may have felt tired, uncertain, or even slightly dulled. But beneath that, something held. Your decisions remained measured. Your values did not slip. Your sense of self stayed intact, even when conditions suggested it should not have. That is not coincidence. What happened involved you directly because it relied on automatic responses, not conscious struggle. Many people rely on effort to remain stable. You did not. Stability was already present. You did not need to fight intrusive thoughts constantly. You noticed them, then they lost traction. You did not need reassurance every hour. You adjusted and continued. This is the difference between resistance and coherence. Resistance reacts. Coherence remains. Resistance exhausts itself. Coherence absorbs pressure and stays operational. You were coherent while pressure passed through your environment. That coherence disrupted a sequence that depends on fragmentation, distraction, and internal noise to complete its cycle. You did not interrupt by acting. You interrupted by not breaking. That is why this message is for you and not for someone who needs to be convinced of their importance. You do not need elevation. You need clarity. You need to understand that your baseline state is not fragile even when you feel worn. This is not about superiority. It is about fit. You fit through a narrow passage without losing form. Many cannot. That is simply factual. Hold that understanding gently. The next layer explains what the pressure was actually testing. There is one symptom you recognized immediately, even if you never named it out loud. A persistent sense of internal pressure that did not match your external circumstances. Not anxiety in the usual sense. Not fear with a clear object. More like your system was being asked to carry more than it was designed to explain. You may have interpreted this as a problem at first. You wondered if you were losing focus, burning out, or failing to recover properly. You questioned your discipline, your motivation, your emotional regulation. You looked for a personal flaw because that is what people are taught to do when tension appears without a visible cause. That interpretation was incomplete. What you experienced was not a malfunction. It was a signal. A signal that your internal structure was encountering compression. Compression does not mean damage. It means force applied to something that already has form. Notice this. Despite the pressure, you remained functional. You showed up. You completed tasks. You kept conversations civil and measured. You did not collapse into reactivity or dissociation. The symptom did not remove your agency. It coexisted with it. That alone tells you something important. If this were weakness, it would have scattered you. If this were instability, it would have escalated. Instead, it stayed contained. Present, but not consuming. That is not how breakdowns behave. That is how transitions announce themselves before language catches up. Your body and mind registered a shift before your thoughts could label it. Subtle fatigue, a narrowing of tolerance for noise, a preference for solitude, a reduced appetite for meaningless interaction. These are often misread as withdrawal or loss of drive. In reality, they are signs of recalibration. You were not becoming less capable. You were becoming more selective. Self-judgment likely entered quietly. You told yourself you should be handling things better, enjoying things more, feeling lighter. That judgment was unnecessary. The pressure you felt was not asking you to perform. It was asking you to stay aligned while conditions changed around you. Pressure reveals structure. It does not create it. You did not fail to relax because you were tense. You did not fail to escape the sensation because it was not meant to be escaped. It was meant to be noticed, understood, and integrated. The confusion came from treating a signal like a symptom to be eliminated. Once you stop fighting it, clarity begins to emerge. This sensation was preparation, not punishment. A signal that your internal systems were being tested for coherence, not endurance. And you passed that test without realizing there was one. The deeper explanation requires looking at what applied the pressure in the first place. Not dramatically, not mythically, practically and precisely. That comes next. What applied the pressure was not imaginary, and it was not internal rumination feeding on itself. It was external in origin, but subtle in delivery. You were not confronted. You were surrounded. The pressure did not arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a coordination of small disruptions that aligned in timing. This matters because random stress overwhelms quickly. Coordinated pressure tests stability. Think back to the recent period. Not distant history, recent enough that your body still remembers it clearly. Multiple demands converged without warning. Expectations increased without explanation. Rest became less effective even when you allowed it. There was no single threat to point to, no obvious antagonist, no dramatic moment that justified the strain. Yet the pressure was real. What you encountered was an invisible confrontation. Not aggressive, not chaotic, structured, quiet. It relied on accumulation rather than force. The goal was not to overwhelm you emotionally, but to erode coherence gradually. To see whether your internal alignment would drift when clarity was taxed repeatedly. You remained functional throughout this period. That is the detail most people overlook. You did not withdraw from responsibility. You did not lose basic regulation. You did not become impulsive or erratic. You adjusted. You simplified. You narrowed your focus. You conserved energy instinctively. Those are not signs of someone being defeated. Those are signs of a system maintaining integrity under load. The timing was intentional. Pressure arrived when you were already carrying obligations, when margin was thin, when recovery required efficiency rather than indulgence. That is how real tests are structured. They do not announce themselves. They blend into life. And yet something important did not happen. You did not turn against yourself. You did not abandon your sense of proportion. You did not lose the thread of who you are, even when you felt quieter, heavier, less expressive. You stayed you. This is where the interruption occurred. The sequence depended on internal fragmentation, on self-doubt escalating into self-betrayal, on fatigue turning into reactivity, on confusion leading to misalignment. None of that completed its cycle. The pressure met coherence and stalled. This was not about heroism. It was about architecture. Your internal structure absorbed stress without deforming. You did not need to name what was happening to remain intact. You did not need to understand it to neutralize its effect. You simply continued operating from a stable center. The next step is to break this experience down into its specific pressure points. Not abstractly, practically. So you can see clearly where stability held and why that matters. The pressure you moved through did not arrive as one unified force. It arrived in segments, each designed to touch a different layer of your experience. This is why it felt confusing at times. You were not dealing with a single problem. You were navigating a pattern made of several pressure points applied close enough together to feel continuous. Let's separate them calmly. The first pressure point was doubt. Not loud doubt, not the kind that shouts accusations. This was quiet surgical doubt. It showed up as small questions about timing, relevance, and direction. You wondered whether your pace was off, whether you were misreading situations, whether your internal sense of rightness was outdated. The key detail is this: the doubt did not overtake your decisions. You noticed it, considered it, then continued acting in alignment with your values. Doubt passed through without becoming your compass. The second pressure point was fear, but not fear of danger. It was fear of stagnation, of being stuck in effort without visible movement, of doing the right things without immediate confirmation. This fear often pushes people into impulsive change or self-sabotage. You did not do that. You stayed measured. You resisted the urge to overhaul your life just to escape discomfort. You tolerated uncertainty without turning it into chaos. The third pressure point was energy drain. Your stamina dipped in ways that rest alone did not fully restore. You may have felt slower, heavier, less expressive. This was not burnout. Burnout erodes motivation and meaning. What you experienced preserved meaning while taxing capacity. Instead of forcing output, you adjusted rhythm. You reduced unnecessary exertion. You conserved without collapsing. That shows regulation, not depletion. The fourth pressure point was isolation. Not abandonment, but a subtle sense of being slightly out of sync with others. Conversations felt thinner. Social engagement required more effort. Many people panic here and overextend themselves to feel connected. You did not. You allowed distance without interpreting it as rejection. You maintained internal companionship. That prevented desperation from entering the system. The fifth pressure point was delay. Outcomes slowed. Feedback loops stretched. Effort did not immediately translate into visible results. This is where many people fracture internally. They equate delay with failure. You did not. You remained oriented even when reinforcement was absent. You did not rush to manufacture certainty. You waited without disengaging. Across all 5 pressure points, one pattern held. You stayed internally regulated. You did not dramatize your experience. You did not seek external validation to stabilize your inner state. You did not abandon yourself to escape discomfort. That is not accidental. Each pressure point tests a different failure mode. Doubt tests clarity. Fear tests impulse control. Energy drain tests regulation. Isolation tests self-relationship. Delay tests patience. You remained coherent across all of them, not perfectly, but sufficiently. This is what interruption looks like in real life. Not fireworks, not confrontation, quiet continuity under load. Now that the components are clear, it becomes possible to review what actually occurred without distortion or self-blame. That reflection brings confirmation, not surprise. Now you can review what occurred without the fog that surrounded it while you were inside it. This is the point where understanding replaces endurance. Not because anything new happened, but because enough distance now exists for evaluation. Look at the sequence as a whole. Pressure appeared. It persisted. It touched multiple areas of your life. And yet, there was no collapse. No sharp deviation from your values. No moment where you lost self-respect or coherence. That alone rules out chance. This was not luck. It was not a good week followed by a bad one. It was not resilience appearing out of nowhere. What held you steady was already present before the pressure arrived. The pressure only revealed it. Notice how you did not need a narrative to survive the experience. You did not need to tell yourself a story about being strong or chosen or tested. You simply responded appropriately to what was in front of you. That is important. People who rely on stories often lose stability when the story fails to comfort them. You did not rely on one. Your system evaluated, adjusted, and continued. There is a temptation at this stage to minimize what happened, to say it was nothing special, to normalize it as just another difficult period. That temptation is understandable, but inaccurate. Many people encounter far less pressure and still fracture internally. They become reactive, resentful, impulsive, or withdrawn. You did not. At the same time, there is no need to inflate the experience into something dramatic. The credibility of what you went through lies in how ordinary it looked from the outside. You went to work. You handled responsibilities. You stayed polite. You kept moving. And yet internally, something significant was being tested and confirmed. You did not become harder. You became clearer. What this review confirms is simple and precise. Your internal coherence is not dependent on favorable conditions. It does not require constant reassurance. It does not dissolve under ambiguity. That makes it reliable. Reliability is rare because it is unglamorous. It does not announce itself. Remove coincidence from the explanation. Remove personality traits and temporary motivation. What remains is structure, a stable inner framework that can absorb pressure, delay reaction, and maintain orientation without supervision. This is not about proving anything to yourself or others. It is about understanding what you can trust about your own functioning. You can trust that when pressure arrives quietly and stays, you will not betray yourself to escape it. That realization changes how you move forward. Not dramatically, subtly. With more confidence in your own internal signal and less urgency to seek external confirmation. The next step is to place this stability in context. Not to elevate it, but to understand how uncommon it actually is without turning it into identity inflation. To understand what this says about you, it helps to look at what typically happens under far less pressure. Most people do not break because of extreme events. They fracture under mild but persistent strain. Unanswered messages, delayed results, ambiguous feedback, a sense of being unseen. These are enough to destabilize many internal systems. Under those conditions, people often lose presence. They ruminate, they over-explain, they chase reassurance, they swing between overconfidence and self-doubt. Their attention scatters. Their behavior becomes inconsistent. This is not a moral failing. It is a common human response to unresolved pressure. You did not respond that way. Your experience stands out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was contained. You stayed present in your body. You stayed functional in your roles. You did not collapse into constant self-analysis or external validation. Even when you felt heavier, you remained oriented. This is uncommon. It is important to say that without turning it into praise. This is not about being better than others. It is about being built differently. Many people rely on emotional momentum to stay regulated. When momentum slows, they lose stability. You did not rely on momentum. You relied on internal coherence. That coherence allowed you to tolerate ambiguity without panic. It allowed you to hold delay without self-rejection. It allowed you to feel pressure without needing to discharge it onto others or yourself. That is not a skill most people are taught, and it is not one most people discover accidentally. When others encounter sustained uncertainty, they often need immediate resolution or distraction. You did not. You allowed uncertainty to exist without letting it dominate your behavior. That restraint is rare because it requires trust in an internal framework rather than constant feedback. Again, this is not superiority. It is suitability. Certain environments and sequences require this level of internal steadiness to pass through without damage. Most people are not meant to pass through them, and that is not a flaw. It is simply a mismatch. You moved through without fanfare, without collapse, without needing to announce what you were carrying. That rarity matters because it points to something structural rather than situational. This was not a peak performance moment. It was baseline behavior under load. That distinction prevents ego inflation and grounds the insight in reality. You do not need to feel special. You need to be accurate. The accuracy is this: your stability under pressure is not activated. It is default. It does not switch on in emergencies. It is already present, quietly supporting you through conditions that unseat most people. The next step is to clarify this identity precisely. Not mystically, not symbolically, structurally. What you need to understand now is not that you accessed some hidden reserve in a moment of need. You did not activate strength. You did not rise to the occasion. You remained who you already are. Your stability is not situational. It is foundational. This is an important distinction because many people mistake temporary endurance for identity. They push themselves through difficulty and then collapse afterward. You did not push. You regulated. Your internal structure was already calibrated for pressure, ambiguity, and delay. That is not something you learn during a crisis. It is something built over time through consistency, reflection, and self-honesty. You do not become coherent under pressure. You reveal coherence under pressure. This identity is not about being unbreakable or immune to strain. You felt the weight. You noticed the drag. You experienced fatigue and narrowing. But none of those sensations destabilized your core. They informed your adjustments. That is maturity, not toughness. There is no need to assign supernatural explanations here. The strength you displayed does not require myth or symbolism. It requires structure, a clear internal hierarchy, values that are not constantly renegotiated, self-awareness that does not turn into self-attack. These are quiet traits, and they are often invisible until tested. You have been preparing for this kind of pressure long before you recognized it as preparation. Each time you chose clarity over drama. Each time you delayed reaction in favor of understanding. Each time you stayed aligned when no one was watching. That is how this baseline was formed. This is why the interruption happened without effort. The sequence you moved through depended on confusion, impulsivity, or fragmentation. Your internal system did not provide those conditions. It stayed integrated. The process could not complete. This does not mean you are finished or exempt from future strain. It means you now have evidence. Evidence that your internal coherence is reliable. Evidence that you do not need to abandon yourself to survive difficulty. Let this identity settle without performance. You do not need to prove it. You do not need to announce it. You simply need to respect it in how you move forward. The final step is integration, practical orientation. How to live from this awareness without becoming rigid, hyper-alert, or isolated. That comes next. Now that the picture is clear, the question becomes practical. How do you live with this awareness without turning it into tension or vigilance? Integration is not about guarding yourself. It is about alignment, returning to a natural rhythm. First, rest without explanation. You do not need to justify your need for recovery or interpret it as weakness. Your system expended energy maintaining coherence under load. Rest is not retreat. It is recalibration. Allow quiet, low-stimulus time without filling it with analysis or productivity. Let your nervous system widen again at its own pace. Second, practice discernment, not suspicion. You do not need to scan your environment for hidden pressure or anticipate the next test. That would distort the very coherence that carried you through. Discernment is calm noticing. Suspicion is contracted attention. Stay with noticing. Trust that your internal signals are clear enough to alert you when something requires adjustment. Third, maintain boundaries without rigidity. You may feel less tolerance for noise, unnecessary demands, or emotionally disorganized interactions. That is not detachment. It is refinement. Set boundaries quietly. Reduce over-explaining. You do not owe access to your energy simply because you can handle pressure. Choose where you invest presence. Fourth, allow patience to replace urgency. Delay no longer needs to feel like a problem to solve. You have seen that delay does not dissolve your stability. Let outcomes unfold without rushing to interpret them. Action taken from impatience erodes coherence. Action taken from clarity reinforces it. Fifth, narrow your focus deliberately. You do not need to do more. You need to do what matters with consistency. Fewer commitments. Cleaner attention. This is not withdrawal. It is precision. Focus protects coherence better than effort ever could. Sixth, stay embodied. Simple physical anchors matter. Sleep hydration movement, quiet breathing. Not as self-optimization, but as maintenance. Your clarity lives in a regulated body, not just a strong mind. Integration is not dramatic. It feels almost ordinary. That is how you know it is working. You are not bracing for impact. You are simply moving forward with less internal noise and more trust in your own structure. There is nothing to defend against right now. There is nothing to prove. There is only the task of living in a way that respects what has already been confirmed. This brings the transmission toward its close. Not with intensity, but with reassurance. You can exhale now. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing is demanding that you become someone else or take on more than you already carry. What needed to be seen has been seen. What needed to hold has already held. The core realization is simple, even if it took time to arrive. You remained intact under pressure that was designed to fragment. Not by force, not by denial, by coherence. That is what matters. And that is what stays with you. Let this understanding rest lightly. You do not need to replay the experience to extract more meaning from it. You do not need to stay alert for repetition. Life will continue, and when pressure appears again, it will meet the same internal structure unless you abandon it. You have no reason to do that. If words help anchor awareness, you can carry these quietly with you. You are steady under strain. You remain aligned without supervision. You trust your internal signal. Say them if you want, or simply remember the feeling behind them. If this message resonated in a way that felt precise rather than exciting, mark it. A simple comment is enough. You can write 777, or you can write I remember. Not for display, for acknowledgement. If you choose to stay connected, subscribe and continue with the next transmission when it appears. Not because you need guidance, but because recognition sharpens clarity over time. Nothing more is required from you in this moment. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not missing anything essential. You are exactly where you need to be, and you know how to stay there. Stay steady.